Hey guys, tonight we wander into the wind-swept hills and misty glens of 13th century Scotland, where every gust seems to whisper secrets of rebellion. Imagine the cold biting through your wool cloak, the ground damp underfoot, and the faint smell of peat smoke curling from scattered cottages. You probably won't survive this if you were a young boy back then. Life had a way of breaking you before breakfast. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's fascinating to see where people join from when we travel through centuries together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey. Together, you trudge along narrow dirt paths, dotted with stones, smoothed by centuries of feet, carrying bundles of firewood, bigger than your arms can manage. Villages cling to valleys, huddled like frightened animals, and the clans that inhabit them are already in simmering unrest. You might think the English king is far away, comfortably seated on his throne, but his tax collectors and soldiers reach even the remotest glens. They arrive with a fanfare that smells more like leather boots and fear than any noble pomp. The locals call it justice, but you learn quickly that it usually means taking livestock, exacting fines, and asserting authority in ways that leave bitter memories. Mainstream history tells us Edward North of England was the first to attempt full dominion over Scotland, levying taxes and installing sheriffs. It's a heavy shadow that stretches even to young William Wallace's upbringing. You wander past thatched huts where women bend over smoke-darkened hearths, stirring thick porridge, and children run barefoot through the mud, faces streaked with soot and laughter. These kids are hardy, they'll need to be. Life is measured by survival, by the skill to throw a stone or handle a pitchfork, not by schooling or fancy manners. One quirky tidbit. In some villages, a child's first lesson in defense was learning to swing a cudgel at a sack of straw. Play and practice indistinguishable, a precursor to the bloody realities to come. You shiver a little at the thought, even your fingers feel colder. Historians still argue whether Wallace's childhood home was a simple farmstead or a small noble estate, and that uncertainty adds a kind of fog to his early years. What is clear, however, is that young Scots in tumult are born with the constant awareness that authority could crush them at any moment. You can almost hear the cattle lowing, the clatter of wooden shoes on stones, and above it all, the faint chant of men rehearsing loyalty to clan and king, or at least pretending to. Every family has stories of raids, of neighboring clans asserting claims over land, of men taken by tax collectors. These stories aren't just bedtime tales. They are warnings, embedded in memory, shaping how a boy like Wallace perceives justice and power. The air feels thick with tension, yet also with possibility. You imagine Wallace running barefoot through the heather, a stick in hand, practicing swings on tree trunks or the occasional scarecrow. His youthful defiance is mirrored in others too. Children daring each other to cross a swollen stream, apprentices refusing a lord's unfair demand, women hiding chickens from inspectors, even as a small figure in a small village. Wallace is absorbing lessons that go beyond the immediate. He is noticing inequality, injustice, and the strength it takes to resist, and the land itself conspires with him. Scotland's geography is not neutral. Hills, rivers, and forests are natural allies. You trudge through misty woods that can hide an ambush, climb ridges that give a lookout advantage, and wade shallow streams that can slow an enemy's advance. These are lessons in strategy long before you see a real battlefield. A quirky reminder: some children used to smear themselves with crocodile dung as sunscreen. Okay, not in Scotland, but the idea that humans improvise bizarre solutions under stress is universal and strangely comforting. It's a hint that ingenuity, even in small doses, can make the difference between life and death. Even as a kid, Wallace senses that the world isn't fair. Taxes feel arbitrary, punishment feels personal, and the English king seems like a distant thunderstorm, always looming, always threatening. You can almost hear the debate among scholars whispering through the centuries. Did these harsh early experiences seed the rebellion? Or was Wallace's nature already predisposed to defiance? Some argue environment forged him. Others insist heroism was innate. You shrug against the wind. It hardly matters now. What matters is that you are walking beside a boy who is learning the rhythms of rebellion, the cadence of injustice, and the early understanding that power can be challenged. You follow him through fields dotted with sheep and cattle, past stone fences and into glens where the air tastes faintly of moss and wet wood. The world is alive with danger, opportunity, and small victories, like catching a rabbit, outsmarting a bully, or sneaking an extra slice of bread. Every experience counts. And here, in this crucible of landscape, law, and human conflict, Wallace's spirit is quietly, inexorably forming. Even if you're just a witness today, you feel it, the thrum of a story that will echo for centuries. You trudge further into the patchwork hills and glens of Scotland, the mist sticking to your hair and the scent of wet earth heavy in the air. It's one of those mornings when the wind carries not only the chill, but a hint of blood and smoke, a warning that life in this time is rarely gentle. You probably won't survive this if you were in Wallace's boots at 12 or 13. But tonight, you get to observe without losing a finger or your head. So, before you get comfortable, remember to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time. It's amazing to trace who's joining this centuries-old story in real time. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on that fan for the soft background hum. And follow me into Wallace's first brushes with violence. You're following Wallace along narrow paths that twist through farmland, the cropland of his youth. The soil is sticky with rain, and he feels the tension in every footstep. English soldiers or rival clans could appear around any corner. It begins small, a quarrel over cattle, a dispute with a neighboring tenant, a clash of words that escalates into fists. And then the sticks come out. You see the first raw spark of his defiance. This isn't yet full-scale rebellion, but the lessons are identical. Watch, wait, Strike, retreat. Every move counts. Mainstream history confirms that William Wallace witnessed, and likely participated in, early skirmishes between Scottish clans and English forces long before the uprising that made him famous. The first taste of violence is shocking and intoxicating in equal measure. Imagine a local thug swinging a club, your heart hammering, your lungs burning as you duck, and then retaliate. You feel adrenaline you didn't know existed, the thrill of testing limits. And there's a quirky detail. Scottish boys in certain regions were said to train with carved wooden swords, sometimes dueling with friends in mock combat until one fell in the mud, bruised but proud. Wallace may have swapped these wooden sticks for real weapons sooner than most. It's not exactly Disneyland fun. It's survival disguised as play. Historians still argue whether these youthful confrontations directly shaped Wallace's later military genius, or if he was simply naturally fearless. You can see why the debate persists. A boy surviving a scuffle could just as easily be lucky as strategically gifted. Either way, the pattern is forming. You notice him learning the rhythm of conflict, the flick of the wrist, the feint, the psychological bluff. And these lessons are etched deep. Every bruise and scraped elbow is a small building block of a future warrior. The air is damp with smoke from a nearby hearth, mixing with the smell of trampled grass and sweat. Villagers peer from behind fences, whispering warnings and stories. Watch the boy. He doesn't flinch. Their words are half exaggeration, half prayer. You almost expect a bard to appear with a lyre, singing the story of the boy who dared. Violence is never just physical, it's social too. Reputation matters, and Wallace quickly learns that fear and respect are closely entwined. One day, a small incident escalates. A forester's son insults Wallace's family, and suddenly you're part of a chase through bracken and thorn, sticks swinging, stones flying. You taste the thrill and the fear. The boy who will become Scotland's most famous rebel experiences a moment of choice. Step back, or fight, and mark yourself as someone who cannot be ignored. He fights, and you feel it, the spark of a lifelong rebellion, igniting in the simplest, most primal way. You notice the landscape responding to violence too. The hills conceal, the rivers offer escape, and thick woods provide both protection and a trap. Wallace learns quickly to move like the wind, fast, unpredictable, and impossible to pin down. A quirky, almost comical detail emerges here. Some villagers believe that whistling at certain bends in the glen could confuse or frighten enemies. Imagine Wallace sneaking along a trail, whistling a tune, and a would-be ambusher pausing, unnerved, long enough for him to vanish. Odd, but it works. Even now, you sense the underlying tension of political currents. English sheriffs, barons, and tax collectors are more than local troublemakers. They are symbols of a foreign grip on Scottish life. Wallace's skirmishes are as much about personal pride as they are about resistance to oppression. Historians still argue whether Wallace's early violence was politically motivated or simply reactive. A boy defending home and kin. You shrug into your wet cloak. the distinction doesn't change the lesson. Defiance is survival. By the end of these first violent encounters, Wallace emerges transformed. You watch him wiping mud and blood from his hands, heart still racing, eyes alight with a mix of fear and exhilaration. He has tasted both the danger and the thrill, and he understands something fundamental. Conflict is inescapable, and courage is measured in moments like these. Each scrape, each shout, each narrow escape becomes a memory carved into muscle and bone, laying the groundwork for a life that will eventually challenge kings. You imagine young Wallace pausing on a ridge at sunset, looking across the glens, lungs still burning, hands stiff from exertion, and realizing that the world is neither kind nor fair. But he also realizes that it is navigable if you can fight smart and move faster than those who would crush you. The first taste of violence, in all its mess and confusion, teaches him strategy, endurance, and timing, the same qualities that centuries later will become legendary. You trudge onward, leaving the muddy skirmishes of his youth behind. But the tension in the air is no lighter. Scotland itself seems to bristle under the weight of foreign rule. Every glen and moor, a potential stage for defiance. You probably won't survive this if you tried it yourself. Rebellion isn't just a romantic idea. It's a gamble with death. So, before you get comfortable, remember to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time. It's oddly comforting to see fellow time travelers scattered across the globe. Now, dim the lights, turn on that fan for the soft background hum, and walk with me into the rise of a rebel. The moment you sense the shift is subtle. Wallace is no longer just a boy defending his family or settling local grudges. He's becoming a figure whom people notice, whispered about in cottages and taverns alike. The English sheriff's presence in the lowlands is heavy, taxes oppressive, and punishments often brutal. Mainstream historians note that Wallace's rise was fueled by these pressures, alongside the execution of local leaders, which left a vacuum that needed a bold hand to fill. You feel the pulse of the countryside. It's restless, like a spring river just before flood season. Wallace starts organizing small bands of men, loosely united by loyalty, shared grievance, and a thirst for revenge. You trudge beside them on the hills, listening to hushed plans in starlit clearings, the clatter of leather, the occasional cough, the scrape of swords on scabbards. Every sound sharpens nerves. A quirky tidbit. Some of Wallace's earliest recruits reportedly included deserters from English garrisons who enjoyed Scottish scenery a bit too much, or maybe just a chance to fight someone other than their own officers. History's little ironies like that are always fun to picture. As word spreads, Wallace's reputation begins to grow like wildfire in a dry forest. You notice villagers starting to leave weapons in strategic places, and families quietly feeding his men as they pass. His charisma is undeniable. He speaks in blunt phrases, but with a presence that commands attention. Scholars still argue whether Wallace's influence grew more from his personal magnetism or from the symbolic timing of his actions against English cruelty. Either way, people start seeing him as a symbol, even if he hasn't asked for it yet. You follow a night raid along a narrow path, the glow of torchlight flickering on mossy stones. Wallace leads with a kind of instinctive precision, yet there's improvisation too. A sudden detour to avoid a patrol, a whispered instruction to silence a sentry. You sense his understanding of both terrain and psychology. He doesn't just fight. He orchestrates fear, hope, and loyalty simultaneously. And the air smells of wet pine and soot. A reminder that rebellion is earthy, messy, and very much alive. Quirkier still, some accounts suggest Wallace used the Scottish landscape almost theatrically, positioning himself on high ridges so his shadow alone could intimidate enemies. Imagine being a tax collector, trudging through fog, and seeing a dark silhouette larger than life, only to find no one there. Your imagination does half the work. That sort of psychological edge is exactly what Wallace leverages as he rises. Tensions simmer across the highlands and lowlands. Every village, every glen, has its own loyalties and grudges. You watch Wallace navigate this fractious landscape, turning suspicion into cohesion, fear into allegiance. It's not just brute force. It's diplomacy in the language of rebellion. Historians still argue whether Wallace's early insurgency was premeditated strategic genius or opportunistic improvisation driven by circumstance. You shrug in the cold evening air. It feels like a bit of both, and that combination is what makes legends. One evening, around a flickering campfire, you hear his men whisper stories of past defeats and victories, of English overreach, of local feuds. Wallace listens, sometimes offering advice, sometimes simply nodding, absorbing details that will later inform larger operations. There's humor here too. Men exaggerate exploits, challenge each other's courage, and occasionally trip over their own feet, creating a scene that's equal parts tense and absurd. A cheeky joke echoes through the firelight. If Wallace can't scare them, the mud will. By the time dawn breaks, you notice a shift. Wallace has grown from a local troublemaker into a nascent leader. You can see it in the way men look to him before acting, how whispers in villages now carry his name with hope rather than fear. The air itself seems charged, like the moment before a storm breaks across the hills. He has become more than a boy. He is the embodiment of defiance, a spark catching in the dry tinder of Scotland's discontent. And as you watch him gaze across the misty valleys, eyes steady, heart racing, hands still smeared with dirt and sweat, you realize that this is the moment the rebel truly takes shape. Every skirmish, every insult, every stolen moment of defiance has led here. Wallace rises not only through his own courage, but through the unrest that courses like a river beneath every hill, every stone, every whispered secret in Scotland. The rise of a rebel is never neat. It is messy, exhilarating, and dangerous. And tonight, you feel it in every step. You trudge deeper into the misty glens and rocky ridges, the wind biting sharper now, carrying a faint metallic tang that hints at the inevitability of violence. Scotland feels alive with tension, every shadow a potential threat, every rustle of leaves a warning. You probably won't survive this if you try to recreate Wallace's early raids. But that's the thrill of observing history from a safe 21st century perch. So, before you get comfortable, remember to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time. It's oddly grounding to know we're scattered across time zones while tracing a medieval rebel's steps. Now, dim the lights, turn on that soft background fan hum, and let's slip into Wallace's early skirmishes. The first real clash you witness isn't a grand battle, but a sudden ambush on a small English patrol. You hear the whispered commands, the clink of leather armor, and the muted curse of startled soldiers. Wallace's men strike with precision, arrows skimming the morning fog, rocks rolled strategically down slopes. Mainstream historians note that guerrilla tactics like these were typical of Wallace's early career, leveraging knowledge of local terrain to offset the English numerical advantage. You feel the thrill and the tension in every step, every shadow, every heartbeat. Quirky detail. Some sources suggest that Wallace's men sometimes disguised themselves with mud and ash, blending into the Scottish landscape so completely that their enemies often mistook trees and rocks for men, or vice versa. Imagine trying to track a shadow in the fog, only to realize it's a bush with a strategically placed stick. It's a little comical if you ignore the deadly stakes. Historians still argue whether these early skirmishes were purely tactical exercises, or if they also served as propaganda, designed to amplify Wallace's growing reputation. You can sense both. He's teaching his men, yes, but he's also sending a message. The English cannot move freely here. Even the terrain conspires with him. Streams slow pursuers, thickets conceal his men, and rocky slopes provide vantage points for archers. Every hill and valley is a chessboard, every tree a pawn or shield. You trudge alongside a band of Wallace's men on a narrow ridge, watching as they silently coordinate. There's a rhythm to their movements, a whisper here, a nod there, that turns chaos into controlled aggression. The patrol doesn't stand a chance. You notice Wallace himself at the center, calm, calculating, almost invisible in the mist. But the energy he radiates commands attention. This is not youthful bravado. It's instinct honed by necessity. The air smells of wet moss, wood smoke, and iron. You almost expect a crow to caw in warning, or maybe just to accentuate the drama. And then there's the human element. Terrified locals peering from cottages, some cheering silently, some cursing under their breath. Wallace's men treat villagers with a surprising mix of respect and pragmatism. They need local goodwill as much as weapons. A cheeky joke circulates among the recruits. We steal their men's hearts before we take their coins. Not literally, thankfully, but it underscores the psychological savvy in his approach. By nightfall, the first skirmishes leave a trail, scattered bodies, seized supplies, and whispers of fear and awe. You trudge through the aftermath, seeing the meticulous care in which Wallace's men remove evidence of their positions and the way they bandage their wounded. Quirky, yes, but also strategic. Leaving your mark is useful. But leaving your enemy alive and rattled is often better. Historians still debate the scale of these early actions. Were they isolated raids or the opening chapters of a national uprising? Either way, the pattern is clear. Wallace's reputation grows with each carefully orchestrated clash. His understanding of terrain and morale sharpening like a blade. You can almost feel the ground beneath you, echoing the footsteps and whispers of history, vibrating with the energy of nascent rebellion. As you trudge back through mist-drenched glens, the weight of early violence settles on your shoulders. Wallace's life is no longer just about defending his home. It's about testing the boundaries of English authority, pushing the limits of what a small, determined band can achieve against a larger, better equipped force. The early skirmishes are messy, chaotic, exhilarating, and instructive. Every moment of tension, every daring maneuver, every whispered instruction is a lesson in rebellion. By the time you pause on a high ridge, surveying the valleys below, you realize that Wallace is becoming more than a fighter. He's becoming a strategist, a leader, and, in a sense, a symbol. The hills themselves seem to conspire with him, the mists hiding his movements, the rocks echoing his commands, the streams slowing his pursuers. And in that quiet, misty dawn, you sense the beginning of the legend that will echo for centuries. You trudge further into the rugged highlands, the heather and bracken scratching at your legs, and the wind carrying a chill that seeps past your cloak. The sun struggles through low clouds, casting pale light over the valleys, and every bend in the path seems alive with possibility or danger. You probably won't survive this if you tried to rally clans without knowing who to trust. But that's the exact tension Wallace thrives on. So, before you get comfortable, remember to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, post your location and local time. It's a curious comfort to see people around the world accompanying you on this journey. Now dim the lights, turn on that soft fan hum, and let's wander into Wallace, stirring the highlands. The clans of Scotland are notoriously independent, each fiercely protective of its land and traditions. You trudge along narrow passes where banners flutter from hilltops. But the symbols don't all signify allegiance. They can also be warnings. Wallace moves carefully, observing, listening, gauging which clans might join his cause. Mainstream history notes that his success depended not only on battlefield skill, but on his ability to unite clans with long-standing rivalries under a common cause. It's a delicate balancing act. One wrong word or perceived insult can spark violence as deadly as an English sword. You slip into a highland settlement at dusk, the air thick with smoke from peat fires and the scent of roasted mutton. Men gather in small circles, arms crossed, boots scuffed, faces shadowed by hoods and sun-darkened skin. Wallace speaks quietly at first, sharing news of small victories, reminding them of English injustices. He doesn't shout. His authority is subtle, almost magnetic. A quirky detail. Some accounts suggest that Wallace would sometimes dress in simple, rough garb to appear one of the people, while occasionally adding a single flourish, a distinctive belt or cloak that marked him as a leader without arrogance. It's a visual shorthand that inspires respect and suspicion simultaneously. Historians still argue whether Wallace's recruitment of Highland clans was motivated more by shared patriotism or opportunism. After all, aligning with a rising rebel could bring both protection and plunder. You trudge past groups of men sparring with wooden swords, and children mimicking their elders, showing early signs of martial discipline. Loyalty is cultivated slowly through shared danger, small victories, and storytelling. Wallace understands that myths matter almost as much as muskets. The narrative of defiance can travel faster than any messenger. The night air carries laughter and occasional curses as feasts are held, offering both sustenance and subtle diplomacy. Wallace shares bread, wine, and stories, weaving connections as much through personal charisma as strategy. You sense the pulse of excitement growing among the clans. They are no longer merely wary observers. They are participants in a larger story. One cheeky joke circulates: follow Wallace, and perhaps you'll live to tell the tale, or at least get a decent dinner first. Even in humor, the stakes are real. The landscape itself plays a supporting role. You trudge along cliffs, overlooking winding rivers, knowing that these natural barriers give strategic advantage to defenders familiar with the land. Wallace uses this knowledge to reassure the clans: fight where the hills help us, and the rivers slow them down. A quirky anecdote notes that he sometimes instructed men to mimic animal calls to confuse enemies, howls and crows echoing in valleys, unnerving opponents who are not accustomed to the wilderness's acoustics. It's clever, psychological warfare at a very local scale. Despite this growing cohesion, tensions simmer beneath the surface. Clans have grudges, rivalries, and ancient feuds. You watch Wallace navigate these, listening to complaints, mediating disputes, and occasionally using humor to diffuse potentially explosive confrontations. Historians still debate whether these diplomatic efforts were as crucial as his combat leadership. One thing is clear: without a mix of charisma, tactical brilliance, and psychological insight, uniting the Highlands would have been impossible. Even as the night deepens, Wallace and his allies train and plan. Torches flicker over sharpened wooden stakes, practice swings, and whispered instructions. The men rehearse ambushes, scouting techniques, and communication signals that will soon form the backbone of more formalized raids. The Highlanders grow confident. Their initial caution gives way to excitement. You feel it in the air, the kind of electric energy that precedes historical upheaval. As dawn rises over misty glens, Wallace surveys the clans, noticing the spark of unity and shared purpose. You trudge behind him, sensing that something extraordinary is taking shape. He has turned isolated villages into a network of resistance, harnessing both terrain and temperament to create a force capable of challenging English authority. Stirring the Highlands isn't just a tactical move. It's the birth of a rebellion that will reverberate across Scotland, echoing in the hills, the rivers, and in the memory of every observer, past and future. You trudge toward the river Forth, the air thick with mist, mud, and the distant clamor of steel on steel. The smell of wet earth is sharper here, almost metallic, and every footstep echoes against the water-worn stones. You probably won't survive this if you were one of the thousands about to clash on Stirling Bridge. But tonight, you get to watch safely. So, before you get comfortable, remember to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time. It's fascinating to see who's following the story as this historic battle unfolds. Now, dim the lights, turn on that soft fan hum, and trudge into the Battle of Stirling Bridge with me. The bridge itself is narrow, barely wide enough for 2 men abreast, a wooden construction stretching over the swift, frothing river below. You trudge across it cautiously, feeling the treacherous sway beneath your boots. Wallace positions his men strategically, understanding that the English will be funneled by this choke point. Mainstream history confirms this clever tactic. By forcing the English to cross in a constricted line, Wallace's smaller force could exploit mobility and knowledge of terrain to devastating effect. You can feel the tension mounting in the air, men shifting nervously, checking weapons, whispering prayers. Quirky detail. It's said Wallace once used a form of early psychological warfare here, sending men in small, noisy groups to appear larger, their war cries echoing off the riverbanks and hillsides. The English, unaccustomed to such cunning from a seemingly ragged army, hesitated. Imagine watching that from the bridge. Mist swirling, shadows moving, and suddenly, your enemy seems twice as many as they really are. Clever and slightly theatrical. Historians still argue whether Wallace's tactics at Stirling were meticulously pre-planned genius or inspired improvisation in the heat of opportunity. You trudge past archers, taking positions on high ground, men gripping spears and axes, and feel the palpable mix of anticipation and fear. The English soldiers, fully armored and confident in their numbers, begin their march across the narrow bridge. Their horses clatter against wooden planks, sending shivers through the structure. You notice the tension in every harness, every shield, every boot step. The calm before a storm. Wallace gives the signal. Suddenly, arrows rain down from hidden slopes, skewering riders and panicking infantry. The bridge shakes with the weight of men, and horses stumbling, slipping, and falling into the frigid river below. You trudge along the sidelines, heart racing, witnessing chaos unfold with a strange, almost cinematic clarity. The battle is loud, the air thick with smoke, and the scent of iron is overwhelming. One cheeky joke spreads among the Scots. It's like the river wanted a few English for breakfast. Dark humor, yes, but it underscores how deeply this landscape is now part of the fight. The English attempt to regroup, but Wallace's men press advantage, cutting off escape routes and exploiting the confusion. Quirkier still, some sources suggest Wallace's soldiers shouted animalistic war cries meant to unsettle armored men unused to the sounds of wild Scottish forests. It may have worked psychologically, or perhaps it was just morale-boosting fun for the Scots. Either way, the effect is unmistakable. Panic spreads through English ranks. momentum shifts dramatically, and victory seems within grasp. You trudge over bodies, broken weapons, and scattered shields, the aftermath vivid and chaotic. The bridge, once narrow and controlled, is now a scene of carnage, yet also of brilliant strategy. Wallace has leveraged knowledge, psychology, and the environment to make every soldier count. Historians still debate the exact number of casualties and whether Stirling Bridge would have been so decisive without the careful coordination of Scottish nobles and local militias. You can feel why it became a legend. The story resonates because it's not just about brute strength, it's about brains, timing, and audacity. Amid the smoke and shouts, you notice Wallace himself moving steadily, eyes scanning the battlefield, hands gesturing calmly to direct reserves. His presence is commanding, but not theatrical. There is no need for spectacle here, just efficiency. The Scottish victory is decisive, but it comes with awareness that the English will not forget this humiliation. You can almost hear the whispered worry among his men, mixed with exhilarated laughter at their unexpected triumph. As the mist begins to clear and the sun pierces the clouds above the fort, you trudge along the riverbanks, watching the aftermath. Survivors are gathered, wounded treated, prisoners accounted for, and tales of bravery already circulating. Wallace has cemented his reputation as a military genius, a figure capable of turning disadvantage into opportunity. The hills themselves seem to whisper his name, carrying stories of strategy, courage, and cunning to every corner of Scotland. By nightfall, Wallace surveys the battlefield from a ridge, the river shimmering under moonlight, the scent of peat and blood mingling in the air. You feel the magnitude of what just occurred. The first true Scottish victory against a far larger English force. Stirling Bridge is more than a battle. It is a symbol, a spark, and the solidifying of a rebel into a legend. The ground beneath your feet seems to hum with stories, and you realize that every strategy, every shout, and every daring risk has brought Wallace closer to immortality. You trudge down from the ridge overlooking Stirling Bridge, the mud sucking at your boots, the air still tinged with smoke and iron, and the echoes of war fading into distant valleys. Scotland feels transformed, alive with whispers and awe, yet tinged with an uneasy tension. You probably won't survive the whirlwind of fame and expectation Wallace is about to face. But tonight, you're here to witness it safely. So, before you get comfortable, remember to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, drop your location and local time. It's oddly grounding to see who's joining the story from around the world. Now dim the lights, turn on that soft background fan hum, and let's trudge into the double-edged world of fame. Word of Stirling Bridge spreads faster than wildfire. Villages whisper about a man who outsmarted the English. Bards begin composing songs, and even towns further south hear tales of a bold Scot striking at tyranny. Wallace becomes a symbol almost overnight. Mainstream history notes that his fame was not limited to Scotland. News reached continental Europe, inspiring admiration and, inevitably, suspicion. You trudge through the countryside, imagining villagers gathering, wide-eyed, discussing how a single man could orchestrate a triumph that seemed impossible. But fame has its costs. You notice the English monarchy bristling, officers desperate to restore honor, and soldiers trained to underestimate Scots, now facing a figure who embodies both defiance and unpredictability. Wallace's name becomes a target as much as a rallying cry. A quirky detail: some local children reportedly began dressing up in makeshift armor and mimicking Wallace's tactics in play, complete with wooden swords and sticks for horse reins. Innocent fun, perhaps, but a little unnerving for passing English patrols. Historians still argue whether Wallace's burgeoning fame helped consolidate Scottish resistance or made him a more obvious target for Edward II's wrath. You trudge past villages where the line between admiration and fear blurs. Some offer supplies and shelter. Others are hesitant, aware that helping the rebel could bring swift and brutal retaliation. Fame is seductive, yes, but it paints a target on your back, and Wallace begins to feel the weight of expectation pressing down like the cold highland mist. You walk along the riverbanks where he once fought, noticing that even allies start holding him to impossibly high standards. Skirmishes are expected to succeed, diplomacy to succeed, morale to remain high. One cheeky joke spreads among his recruits. Wallace, are we legends or just footnotes waiting for a song? Humor masks tension, but it also underscores the constant pressure fame brings. Every move Wallace makes is now scrutinized, celebrated, or criticized, and every misstep could be disastrous. The English response is relentless. Armies are dispatched, spies infiltrate towns, and the network of Scottish allies is tested. Wallace learns quickly that fame can inspire, but it can also betray. Quirky, but true. Some chroniclers later noted that English officers sometimes mistook ordinary villagers for Wallace's agents, leading to panic and confusion. Fame, in this sense, becomes both shield and snare, a double-edged sword. Amid this, Wallace must navigate diplomacy. You trudge alongside him as he meets with local nobles, forging alliances that are as precarious as the hills are steep. He speaks with calm authority, yet beneath the surface, tension simmers. Some nobles envy his fame, some resent his audacity. Historians still debate how much of Wallace's leadership relied on genuine respect versus the fear and awe his reputation commanded. Either way, he is constantly aware that every action carries a ripple effect, potentially strengthening or fracturing the rebellion. Even personal relationships become complicated under the spotlight. Families seek favor, rivals plot quietly, and loyalty is tested in ways the battlefield never could. Wallace is aware that fame can isolate as much as it unites, and the loneliness of being a living symbol starts to creep in. The air is heavy, thick with smoke, sweat, and expectation. You sense the delicate balance he must maintain between inspiring hope and managing fear, between boldness and prudence. By the time night falls over the misty glens, Wallace stands surveying the land he has defended, the communities he has inspired, and the growing shadow of his fame. You trudge beside him in thought, feeling the weight of legend pressing on shoulders too young for such burdens. Fame has lifted him into history, yes, but it also comes with relentless scrutiny, danger, and the sobering knowledge that every step forward could be a step into peril. The cost of legend, you realize, is never counted in gold or glory alone. It is measured in tension, vigilance, and the constant, exhausting demand to embody more than any mortal could reasonably carry. You trudge northward along the misty edges of Scotland, the wind tugging at your cloak, carrying the scent of whetstone and pine. The air feels heavier here, thick with expectation and responsibility. Wallace has grown beyond a daring rebel. He's now, in a very real sense, a guardian of Scotland. You probably won't survive the constant vigilance he must maintain. But tonight, you can walk safely in his shadow. So, before you get comfortable, remember to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And post your location and local time. It's strangely comforting to know we're all wandering these glens together. Now dim the lights, switch on that soft fan hum, and let's trudge into the world of Wallace. As Scotland's guardian, the mantle is heavy. You trudge beside him on narrow trails, where every sound carries, every shadow could signal threat. Wallace must constantly balance military strategy with diplomacy. The clans he once rallied now look to him not only for courage, but for protection, advice, and sometimes arbitration in disputes that could ignite bloody feuds. Mainstream history notes that Wallace, as Guardian of Scotland, acted almost like a regent, commanding armies and negotiating with nobles, while Edward the Firm pressed relentlessly. You can feel the weight of that dual responsibility. Fight or flee, negotiate or assert, inspire or intimidate, all in the same breath. Quirky detail: Wallace reportedly used visual signals, flags, horns, and even fires in distant hills to communicate with scattered forces. It's an early form of strategic coordination that might seem quaint today, but in the fog and mountains of medieval Scotland, it was brilliant. You imagine scanning a valley and seeing plumes of smoke, announcing maneuvers or warnings to allies miles away. A simple system that could save lives or doom an army. Historians still argue whether Wallace's leadership relied more on charisma, battlefield genius, or sheer luck navigating treacherous alliances. You notice that the clans are notoriously fractious. Old grudges simmer beneath loyalty. Wallace listens to complaints, intervenes in disputes, and mediates with patience sharpened by necessity. He knows that a single misstep, favoring one clan too heavily, or misjudging a noble's ambition, could unravel his carefully woven coalition. You trudge past a stream where a handful of warriors practice sword play, their eyes alert, ready to defend not just territory, but a vision of Scottish independence. The English threat never disappears. Patrols move like shadows along glens. Taxes and conscriptions loom, and spies lurk in every town. Wallace's role is as much about intelligence as it is about combat. He gathers information, tests rumors, and plans operations that will keep Scotland's heartland safe. One cheeky detail: he supposedly once used a herd of cows to mask troop movements, sending the animals along a valley to obscure the position of advancing soldiers. Clever, amusing, and terrifyingly effective. You trudge through villages where Wallace's presence is both reassurance and pressure. People expect protection from raids, guidance on defense, and hope that their sons and husbands will return alive from skirmishes. He moves constantly, from ridge to glen, from council to council, embodying the guardian role in every gesture, every word. Historians still debate how much of his authority came from formal recognition versus the aura of legend his victories created. Either way, he commands respect, even when it is mingled with fear. Amid this, Wallace also navigates diplomacy with continental allies and Scottish nobles who may not always see eye to eye. You feel the tension as he negotiates, aware that every handshake or promise carries consequences. The Guardian's role is never static. It's a constant negotiation between power, principle, and survival. He has become more than a rebel. He is a symbol and a practical protector, embodying Scotland's aspirations while constantly mitigating internal and external threats. Even in the quiet moments, the weight of expectation presses down. You notice him pausing atop a hill, staring into the mist, calculating routes, contingencies, and the ever-present threat of betrayal. One quirky anecdote recalls Wallace testing bridges and fords, sometimes personally inspecting the terrain before any army could cross, ensuring the safety of men and supplies. It's hands-on leadership in a world where mistakes are fatal. By nightfall, as you trudge along with him across shadowed ridges, it becomes clear that being Guardian of Scotland is as much about vision as courage. Wallace has become a living emblem of resistance and protection, his every movement shaping the morale and survival of a nation. The land itself seems to respond to his presence. Rivers slow the advance of enemies. Hills conceal loyal forces, and the wind carries word of his deeds. You feel in your bones the magnitude of responsibility resting on him, the dual burden of soldier and sentinel, legend and protector. You trudge through the highland valleys as twilight drapes its violet shadows over the hills, the air tinged with the scent of peat smoke and damp heather. Scotland feels almost otherworldly, every ridge and stream a potential stage for both history and legend. You probably won't survive the intrigue and whispers swirling around Wallace if you were a living participant, but tonight you get to observe safely. So, before you get comfortable, remember to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, post your location and local time. It's strangely comforting to see fellow travelers in this chronicle. Now dim the lights, switch on that soft fan hum, and let's wander into the tangled tales of romance or propaganda surrounding Wallace. Stories of Wallace's personal life begin to surface alongside his growing fame. Bards sing of a woman, sometimes named Marion, who captured his heart, though details are murky. Mainstream historians acknowledge that Wallace's love life, if it existed in the romanticized forms later told, was overshadowed by his military and political engagements. You trudge along narrow paths, imagining clandestine meetings under the cover of night. whispered conversations across stone bridges, and glances exchanged in the candlelight of humble cottages. Quirky detail. Some ballads claim that Wallace used coded signals, like dropping a particular flower or leaving a carved symbol on a tree to communicate with his beloved across villages. Whether true or invented, these gestures add an almost fairy tale quality to a man otherwise associated with war and rebellion. The line between reality and legend blurs, and it's hard not to be charmed by the notion of a guerrilla leader moonlighting as a romantic. Historians still argue whether these tales of romance were genuine or crafted later to humanize Wallace and inspire loyalty. You trudge past villages where storytellers recount exaggerated or even entirely fictional episodes of daring rescues, secret meetings, and tender gestures. Propaganda or genuine affection? Perhaps both, but the stories certainly serve a purpose. They make the legend more relatable, more inspirational, and more enduring. The interplay between myth and strategy is subtle but critical. You notice that tales of Wallace's personal exploits circulate alongside reports of raids and victories. Villagers repeat them eagerly, and they bolster morale, creating a dual identity. Wallace as both fearless warrior and principled man of honor. One cheeky anecdote suggests that rival English soldiers sometimes hesitated, fearing that Wallace's reach, even romantic influence, might extend to betrayal from within local communities. Quirky, yes, but indicative of how legend can shape reality. Political propaganda interweaves with these romanticized accounts. Wallace's enemies are portrayed as ruthless, while he is cast as virtuous and almost superhuman in loyalty and courage. Songs and poems amplify both his heroism and humanity, a combination that proves powerful for recruitment and morale. Historians still debate how much of this romantic Wallace influenced actual political alliances or decisions during the rebellion. You trudge along, imagining communities rallying under banners of hope, inspired not just by military victories, but by the moral and emotional narrative surrounding him. Even as these stories grow, Wallace himself remains enigmatic. You follow him as he moves from skirmish to council, from campfire to hidden glen, a man of action shadowed by myth. The tales of romance, real or imagined, circulate widely, giving ordinary Scots a figure to admire and idealize. Quirkier yet, some ballads claim that the young lovers would exchange messages via messenger pigeons. Clearly an embellishment, but one that illustrates the human need to blend fact and fantasy. By nightfall, you trudge alongside Wallace as he surveys the hills, reflecting on loyalty, love, and legend. Whether Marion, or any figure in these tales, truly existed is uncertain, but the effect is real. Villagers, soldiers, and allies see him as more than a warrior. They see a man capable of loyalty, courage, and even tenderness. The stories serve to unify communities, boost morale, and craft a larger-than-life image that will persist for centuries. In the end, whether romance or propaganda, these narratives weave a crucial part of Wallace's legend. They remind you that history is not only a record of deeds, but also a tapestry of stories spun to inspire, manipulate, and endure. As you trudge past the flickering lights of villages and across the silent hills, you realize that Wallace's legend is as much about perception as reality. a hero constructed from both battlefield triumphs and whispered tales of heart. You trudge through the lowlands toward the English-occupied strongholds, the wind carrying the bitter tang of smoke and iron, and the distant clatter of armor echoing across the hills. Scotland seems smaller here, constricted under the looming shadow of Edward III's wrath. You probably won't survive facing Edward's retaliation if you were one of Wallace's men, but tonight, you get to follow safely. So, before you get comfortable, remember to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and post your location and local time. It's oddly grounding to know we're all scattered across time zones while tracing this revenge-fueled history. Now dim the lights, turn on that soft fan hum, and let's trudge into Edward's wrath. News of Stirling Bridge reaches Edward IV like a thunderclap. His pride wounded, his authority challenged, he vows to crush the rebellion and punish Wallace. Mainstream history confirms that Edward responded by mobilizing one of the largest English armies yet seen in Scotland, determined to assert control and send a clear message. You trudge alongside the English reinforcements as they march through narrow valleys and muddy roads, banners snapping in the wind, men muttering grievances, horses snorting in protest. The tension is palpable. Pride, fear, and fury mingle in the same breath. Quirky detail. Chroniclers later claimed that Edward insisted on personally inspecting battle plans while wearing elaborate ceremonial armor, including a helmet decorated with gilded lions. Imagine the king trudging through mud, squinting at maps, while generals mutter under their breath. A comical contrast to the grim purpose of the campaign, but it underscores Edward's obsession with image and authority. Historians still argue whether Edward's wrath was motivated purely by vengeance, strategic necessity, or the need to project power across his dominions. You trudge past English camps where officers debate routes, supply lines, and intelligence, tension mounting as the Scots' elusive tactics frustrate them. Edward's army moves like a massive machine, slow, imposing, and meticulously organized. Yet every delay and misstep risks emboldening Wallace and his men. Wallace, anticipating retaliation, doubles down on reconnaissance and guerrilla tactics. You trudge along with scouts, surveying the terrain. Rivers that could slow an army, hills that provide cover, narrow passes ideal for ambushes. The Scots' familiarity with their land becomes a decisive advantage. One cheeky anecdote. Wallace reportedly instructed villagers to sound warning horns or ring church bells in coded patterns, creating confusion among English troops who could not distinguish friend from foe. It's clever, almost playful, but deadly effective. As Edward's army presses into the Scottish heartland, Wallace's forces strike unpredictably, harassing supply lines, ambushing patrols, and retreating before a full engagement is possible. The English feel the sting of humiliation, their pride and wrath intensifying. Quirkier still, some sources suggest Edward demanded regular daily prayers for victory in his camp, believing divine favor would restore English honor. Historians still debate whether these rituals had any practical effect or were merely psychological comfort for nervous soldiers. You trudge through villages caught in the crossfire, sensing the fear and awe in the eyes of locals. Some secretly supply Wallace's men, others hide their allegiance, wary of the king's vengeance. Wallace, ever aware of public sentiment, uses this dynamic to his advantage, balancing action with diplomacy to keep support intact. Every choice carries weight. One misjudged strike could lead to reprisals. One misread message could unravel months of careful planning. Edward's wrath escalates further as he lays siege to towns that have supported Wallace. You trudge past the smoke-filled horizons, hearing distant shouts, seeing the flicker of torches and flames. The English army is disciplined and well-equipped, but Scotland's terrain is unforgiving. Wallace's men exploit every ridge, river crossing, and wooded glen. A cheeky joke circulates among the Scots. The king may have the numbers, but we have the hills, and maybe a few angry cows. Humor keeps morale alive in the darkest moments. By nightfall, Wallace surveys the movement of Edward's forces, noting every vulnerability, every opportunity for disruption. You feel the weight of impending conflict pressing across the valleys. Edward's wrath is real, formidable, and relentless, but Wallace's ingenuity, knowledge of the land, and growing legend create a counterforce no single king can easily crush. The tension between raw power and cunning strategy hums through the air, a prelude to the trials and clashes yet to come. In this moment, you trudge alongside the Guardian of Scotland as he prepares for a storm of retaliation. Edward's wrath is immense, personal, and methodical, yet Wallace stands resolute, a symbol of defiance against overwhelming odds. You sense that this chapter will test not only military skill, but the very resilience of a nation and the legend that will emerge from it. Scotland itself seems to hold its breath as history waits to unfold. You trudge through misty forests and craggy hills, the wind tugging at your cloak and carrying the scent of wet pine and smoke. The echoes of Stirling Bridge's triumph are fading, replaced by the relentless pressure of Edward's forces sweeping across the countryside. Wallace is no longer the victorious leader of a celebrated skirmish. He's a hunted man. You probably won't survive being on the run from a king's army. But tonight, you get to follow safely. So, before you get comfortable, remember to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and post your location and local time. It's oddly grounding to see who's tracing this perilous flight with you. Now, dim the lights, turn on that soft fan hum, and let's trudge alongside Wallace as he flees across Scotland. The Scottish landscape that once offered advantage now feels oppressive. Dense woods, narrow valleys, and winding rivers become both shield and cage. You trudge silently beside scouts and messengers who carry vital intelligence, every footstep a risk. Mainstream history notes that after Edward's forces regrouped and intensified their campaign, Wallace was forced into hiding, moving from glen to glen, often relying on the goodwill of villagers and sympathetic nobles. The thrill of evasion is tempered by exhaustion, hunger, and the ever-present shadow of capture. Quirky detail. Some chronicles suggest that Wallace sometimes disguised himself as a humble shepherd or merchant, even tying his long hair under a hood or donning patched clothing to avoid recognition. Imagine the mighty guardian of Scotland, trudging through muddy paths in a simple tunic, keeping one eye on the tree line for enemy patrols. It's both ingenious and almost comical to picture, if not for the deadly stakes. Historians still argue whether Wallace's period on the run was a strategic withdrawal to preserve forces, or simply a desperate attempt to survive overwhelming odds. You trudge past isolated cottages where sympathetic villagers provide food, a warm fire, or a hidden corner. Their bravery, quiet and understated, is as vital as any sword strike. Every interaction carries risk. A single betrayal could undo months of careful evasion. Edward's patrols intensify. You hear the distant clatter of armored boots, the shouted orders of officers, the barking of dogs trained to track fugitives. Wallace moves with uncanny awareness, reading the landscape as a map of threats and opportunities. One cheeky anecdote. In some accounts, Wallace is said to have led English soldiers in circles so often that they began to doubt their maps and commanders' judgment. Quirky, yes, but it reflects the cunning and psychological dexterity he wielded even while on the run. The strain of constant movement weighs on him and his men. You trudge alongside warriors who are exhausted, muddy, and hungry, yet fiercely loyal. Their camaraderie, whispered jokes, and quiet encouragement keep spirits alive. Historians still debate how much of Wallace's leadership during this period relied on tactical brilliance versus the sheer magnetism of his legend. Either way, morale is fragile, and every word, glance, and gesture matters. Some nights, Wallace hides in dense forests, listening to the wind rattle through trees, the distant howl of wolves, and the occasional scream of an English patrol spooked by shadows. He uses these moments to plan, reflect, and sometimes to rest briefly before moving again at first light. Quirky detail. One chronicler whimsically claimed Wallace once hid behind a pile of hay so effectively that English soldiers tripped over him without recognizing their quarry. It's amusing in retrospect, but underscores the improvisational skill of survival in hostile territory. Despite the danger, Wallace continues to inspire. You trudge past villagers who whisper his name with reverence, leaving food and messages in secret spots, sustaining both him and the rebellion. Each narrow escape, each clever diversion, feeds the legend, reinforcing the idea that he is more than a man. He is an embodiment of Scotland's indomitable spirit. One cheeky joke among his followers: if Wallace disappears for a week, just assume he's climbing a hill, hiding from Edward, or inventing a new trick to annoy the English. By day, you trudge along hidden trails, rivers, and glens, avoiding patrols. By night, you watch Wallace gather his inner circle, planning raids, distributing intelligence, and reinforcing morale. Every move is calculated, every pause deliberate. Historians still argue whether his survival was luck, skill, or the near mythical devotion of Scottish villagers. You feel the tension in every step, the fragility of human life against the machinery of a king's army. As the sun sets behind misty ridges, you realize that Wallace on the run is as much about endurance and cunning as it is about courage. The hunted man becomes a symbol. Every escape fuels hope and fear, In equal measure, Scotland itself seems to hold its breath. The hills, whispering stories of a fugitive who refuses to yield, turning flight into strategy and survival into legend. You trudge through the rolling lowlands, where the fog hangs low over tilled fields, and the air carries the scent of damp soil and burning peat. Scotland seems quieter here, but the stillness is deceptive. Danger lurks in shadows, behind friendly doors, and in whispered promises. You probably won't survive the treacherous politics of the lowlands if you were Wallace. But tonight, you can observe safely. So, before you get comfortable, remember to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, post your location and local time. It's oddly grounding to see who's following this story from across the world. Now dim the lights, turn on that soft fan hum, and let's trudge into betrayal in the lowlands. Wallace's triumphs and reputation have made him both admired and envied. You trudge alongside him as he navigates towns where loyalty is murky, alliances fragile, and threats often hidden behind courteous smiles. Mainstream historians note that during this period, Scottish nobles were divided. Some supported Wallace fully, others reluctantly, and some harbored secret loyalties to Edward I. Every handshake could mask ambition. Every invitation to supper could conceal danger. Quirky detail. A few accounts suggest that Wallace would sometimes test the loyalty of local nobles by sending decoy messages or arranging minor feints to see who might report to the English. Imagine watching a master of guerrilla warfare playing subtle chess with real human lives. Clever, nerve-wracking, and a little theatrical. Historians still argue whether Wallace's betrayals were inevitable due to fractured politics, or whether some could have been prevented with different diplomacy. You trudge past isolated manor houses, where local lords smile politely, but hide daggers in metaphorical and sometimes literal senses. Wallace senses tension in every corridor, hears it in every whisper, and watches it in every careful glance. The lowlands are strategically crucial, providing both access and exposure. Wallace's forces rely on speed, intelligence, and local guides to navigate these open areas. But the risk of treachery is constant. One cheeky anecdote tells of Wallace's men leaving behind a few barrels of spoils that were actually empty, observing which nobles reported their whereabouts to the English. Quirky, yes, but it highlights the constant balancing act between trust and vigilance. Betrayal manifests in multiple forms: informants providing intelligence to Edward's army, nobles refusing shelter, and ambushes orchestrated under the guise of hospitality. You trudge through villages where the air is thick with suspicion. Even loyal allies glance nervously at strangers. Wallace must discern friend from foe, often relying on intuition honed by experience, reading body language, and interpreting subtle signals. Despite these challenges, Wallace adapts quickly. You trudge with him as he reorganizes forces, sets diversions, and ensures that loyal communities remain protected. Quirky detail. In some stories, he is said to have left decoy camps, complete with fires and sounds of activity, to mislead traders and English scouts alike. These clever deceptions buy time and sow confusion, turning betrayal into tactical advantage. Historians still debate the exact scale and impact of betrayal in the lowlands. Some argue it slowed Wallace's campaigns significantly. Others suggest it forced him to innovate and become a sharper, more cautious leader. Either way, the lessons are clear. Trust is fragile, intelligence is vital, and even the most revered hero is vulnerable to the ambitions of allies. You trudge past quiet glens where Wallace pauses, reflecting on the double-edged nature of loyalty. Every gesture, every word, every alliance is measured carefully. You sense the weight pressing on him, the burden of guiding a rebellion while navigating the treacherous landscape of human ambition. One cheeky joke among his men keeps spirits alive. If we survive the English, the nobles might finish us off. Humor and vigilance walk hand in hand. As night falls, Wallace positions his forces in hidden locations, anticipating both enemy attack and the potential for betrayal from within. The lowlands are beautiful, rolling, and seemingly peaceful, but beneath that serenity lies a network of risk and intrigue. You trudge alongside him, sensing the tension and brilliance that come from constant adaptation. Betrayal in the lowlands isn't just a threat, it's a crucible, shaping Wallace into a leader capable of reading both men and terrain with unmatched skill. By the time moonlight illuminates the river bends and shadowed hills, you realize that every betrayal has honed Wallace's caution, strategy, and resilience. Scotland itself seems to whisper warnings, echoing the delicate dance between loyalty and self-interest. And you can feel the tension in the air, the kind that forges legends out of human ambition and cunning. You trudge through the misty outskirts of Glasgow, the damp earth squelching underfoot, and the smell of smoke and river water mingling in the chilly air. Scotland feels tense, every village a potential trap, every shadow a harbinger. Wallace, once a fearless commander and revered hero, is now a hunted man pressed against a tightening noose. You probably won't survive the peril of capture if you are in his place. But tonight, you can follow safely. So, before you get comfortable, remember to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And post your location and local time. It's grounding to see fellow travelers tracing this grim chapter with you. Now, dim the lights, turn on that soft fan hum, and let's trudge into capture and humiliation. The betrayal you sensed in the lowlands culminates in Wallace's arrest. You trudge through narrow, cobblestone streets as English forces, tipped off by a local noble or informant. Historians still debate the exact culprit, spring their trap. Wallace, despite his legendary cunning, is seized with minimal resistance, the weight of betrayal crushing as effectively as the manacles around his wrists. Mainstream accounts confirm that Edward orders the capture to demonstrate the consequences of defiance. It is a political spectacle as much as a strategic victory. Quirky detail. Some chronicles suggest Wallace was apprehended not in open battle, but while disguised, possibly as a common merchant or traveling minstrel, highlighting the lengths he went to evade capture. Imagine the iconic rebel, hiding behind a cart of vegetables, only to be dragged away by armored soldiers. It's almost absurd if the stakes weren't so deadly. You trudge with him into imprisonment, the air thick with the mingling odors of damp stone, sweat, and fear. The humiliation is meticulously designed. Wallace is paraded through towns, handcuffed and bound, a warning to those who might consider rebellion. English crowds jeer, some in genuine fear, others in opportunistic curiosity. Historians still argue whether Edward's intent was punishment, deterrence, or psychological warfare to crush the Scottish spirit. The effect is unmistakable. The people who once revered Wallace see their guardian reduced to a captive, and morale trembles. Inside dank cells, Wallace endures interrogation, public ridicule, and the stripping of symbols that once marked him as Scotland's hero. You trudge through dark corridors, imagining the stifling chill of stone walls, the flickering torchlight casting dancing shadows, and the quiet despair punctuated by occasional defiant glances from the prisoner. Cheeky, almost ironic detail. One account hints that Wallace maintained his dignity to the point that guards allegedly joked about his stoic frown, wondering if he ever actually blinked in protest. The English craft a spectacle of humiliation, parading him through towns to maximize political impact. You trudge alongside this grim procession in thought, feeling the tension and shame intended to break him psychologically, not just physically. Quirky, but true. Contemporary songs and ballads later suggest that children and villagers would mock him in playful rhymes, unaware of the deeper political purpose, turning his humiliation into folk memory. Historians still debate whether Wallace's capture demoralized the rebellion entirely or inadvertently strengthened his legend. You trudge past spectators, soldiers, and officials, sensing that the narrative of a captured hero begins to intertwine with myth. Even in chains, Wallace's presence exerts influence. His defiance, silent or verbal, inspires whispers of courage and tales that will outlast the intended shame. The journey toward execution begins, yet every step amplifies his symbolic weight. You trudge alongside him in imagination as the Scottish landscape, from hills to rivers, seems to mourn his captivity. Wallace's physical vulnerability contrasts sharply with the growing intangible force of his legend. Cheeky observation: some English chroniclers, uncomfortable with his charisma, admit that even shackled, he commands attention in ways they cannot control. By nightfall, you trudge through the aftermath of his capture, the hushed towns, the wary villagers, the English patrols maintaining order. The humiliation Wallace endures is not merely personal, it is meant to resonate across Scotland, to make rebellion appear futile. Yet the human spirit, ever stubborn, begins to reinterpret the story. You realize that capture and humiliation, rather than ending his influence, sets the stage for a legend that will outlast any chains or public display. The shadow of Wallace looms larger even in defeat. Every whispered story, every song, and every remembered glance transforms imprisonment into the seed of immortality. Scotland watches, tense and inspired, as the man who once stirred the Highlands becomes both a cautionary tale and a rallying point, a paradoxical symbol of defiance forged in chains. You trudge down the grim corridors of London toward the imposing halls of Westminster, the air thick with smoke, human sweat, and the bitter tang of fear. Wallace, once guardian of Scotland, now walks as a prisoner beneath towering banners of his conqueror. You probably won't survive the cold calculations of a medieval trial if you were in his position, but tonight you get to observe safely. So, before you get comfortable, remember to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and post your location and local time. It's grounding to see who's tracing this dark chapter with me. Now dim the lights, switch on that soft fan hum, and let's trudge into Wallace's trial and the controversies surrounding it. The trial is swift, merciless, and politically charged. You trudge through stone corridors lined with armed guards, hearing whispers of accusation and murmurs of awe at the legendary Scot, now standing in chains. Mainstream history confirms that Wallace is charged with treason against Edward the Worse, the very king he refused to recognize as sovereign over Scotland. You sense the tension in the air. This is no mere legal proceeding. It's theater designed to crush rebellion and reinforce the authority of the English crown. Quirky detail. Some accounts claim that Wallace refused to acknowledge the court's authority entirely, allegedly stating that he owed allegiance only to Scotland and God. Imagine a man in chains, scorned and defiant, challenging an entire legal system with a glance and a single word. It's audacious, terrifying, and somehow emblematic of his stubborn character. Historians still argue whether the trial had any genuine pretense of fairness or was entirely a political spectacle. You trudge through the courtroom, imagining judges in ceremonial robes, scribes scurrying to record testimony, and Edward I watching from a throne above, his gaze both calculating and vindictive. The tension is palpable. Every word Wallace utters could be twisted, every silence interpreted as guilt. The charges themselves are complex. Beyond simple treason, Wallace faces accusations of rebellion, murder of English officials, and inciting civil unrest. You trudge alongside him in thought, considering how a man who once fought to defend his homeland now faces a legal system crafted to make him an example. One cheeky anecdote. Some chroniclers note that Wallace maintained a biting wit even in court, reportedly answering insults with pointed remarks that left his interrogators both frustrated and impressed. Humor amid terror, a coping mechanism, and subtle defiance. The trial is not just legal, it is propaganda. English chroniclers aim to portray Wallace as a criminal, a disruptor of order, while Scottish sympathizers later emphasize his heroism, piety, and unwavering patriotism. Historians still debate the balance between fact and embellishment in these accounts, noting that the legend of Wallace often overshadows the gritty realities of his final days. You trudge past the echoing halls, sensing that the story is being shaped not just in stone and parchment, but in the collective memory of two nations. Witnesses are brought forward, some coerced, others willingly testifying against him. You trudge through the imagined courtroom, hearing conflicting accounts, some praising his courage, others condemning his acts as criminal. The atmosphere is charged with fear, loyalty, and the weight of political calculation. Quirky detail. One anecdote suggests that Wallace, despite chains and humiliation, refused to kneel before the king or judges, his posture alone making a statement of defiance. that would echo in ballads for centuries. The verdict is inevitable, yet the trial itself ignites controversy that persists for centuries. You trudge with the knowledge that every contemporary observer interprets Wallace differently, as criminal, patriot, martyr, or legend. Historians still argue about the trial's fairness, the validity of charges, and the influence of political propaganda in shaping perceptions. Even in the certainty of condemnation, Wallace exerts a strange moral power, challenging the authority that seeks to crush him. By nightfall, you trudge out of the courtroom into the damp streets of London, feeling the tension linger in the air. Wallace's trial has ended, but controversy thrives. Stories of courage, indignity, and political machinations intertwine, forming a narrative that refuses to fade. You realize that in this trial, as in life, Wallace is both subject and storyteller, crafting a legacy that defies chains, verdicts, and even time itself. You trudge along the cold, stone-paved streets leading to Smithfield, London, where the air is thick with smoke, the acrid tang of burning peat, and the uneasy murmur of gathered crowds. Today, history and legend will collide in a way that will echo for centuries. You probably won't survive the intensity of public spectacle if you were Wallace. But tonight, you can observe safely. So, before you get comfortable, remember to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, as always, post your location and local time. It's grounding to see who's tracing this fateful chapter. Now, dim the lights, switch on that soft fan hum, and let's trudge into execution and martyrdom. The crowd is massive, a mix of curious Londoners, fearful locals, and soldiers eager to witness the king's justice. Wallace is brought forward, shackled, and stripped of insignia, every gesture designed to humiliate and intimidate. Mainstream history records that his execution involved hanging, drawing, and quartering, a brutal method intended to serve as a deterrent. You trudge in thought through the tension in the air, imagining whispers of fear, admiration, and awe, blending into a cacophony of human emotion. Quirky detail. Some chroniclers note that Wallace maintained his composure, even as the executioners prepared, reportedly staring at the crowd or muttering quiet prayers, a calm defiance that unnerved onlookers. Imagine standing before certain death, yet projecting a dignity so complete that even your enemies pause in their ritual of cruelty. Historians still argue whether Wallace's execution ultimately cemented him as a martyr, or if it was primarily a calculated act of terror by Edward the Scherz. You trudge past soldiers who murmur among themselves, noting the paradox of fear and inspiration intertwining. Even as the procedure unfolds, Wallace's courage becomes the seed for a legend far greater than any king's punishment could erase. The sequence of the execution is methodical, horrifying in its intention, but you focus on the human and symbolic dimensions. Each step, the hanging, the disembowelment, the quartering, is meant to strip Wallace of humanity and authority. Yet in the eyes of many Scottish witnesses, even distant and hidden, these acts transform him into a symbol. Quirky anecdote. Some sources suggest that the heads of traitors were displayed along city gates, but Wallace's defiance was so palpable that passers-by reportedly felt a shiver of respect rather than fear. You trudge in imagination through the paradox. A man broken in body, yet elevated in spirit. The public nature of his death is a political tool, but it also plants the seeds of enduring legend. Historians still debate how contemporary Scots interpreted the spectacle, some in despair, some in quiet rebellion, some inspired to continue the struggle for independence. Every eyewitness contributes unknowingly to the mythos. Even amid horror, Wallace's personal courage remains striking. You imagine him meeting each stage of execution with unwavering resolve, a psychological resistance that surpasses physical suffering. Cheeky, almost ironic detail. Chroniclers later joke that his defiance made the executioners wish they had studied law instead of torture, highlighting how legend often softens historical brutality with wit and awe. After the execution, his body is dismembered and parts displayed as warnings. Yet in every village, every glen, and every whispered retelling, Wallace becomes more than a man. He becomes an idea. You trudge through the mental landscape of Scotland, imagining children repeating songs of the hero, bards composing ballads, and common folk recounting his bravery. This transformation, execution into martyrdom, is a testament to the human tendency to elevate courage and defiance above cruelty. Historians still argue whether martyrdom was immediate or a process that unfolded over decades through storytelling and legend making. You trudge past imagined taverns, cottages, and hilltops where Scots retell the tale, embellishing, inspiring, and ensuring Wallace's spirit lives on. His execution, intended to crush hope, paradoxically inflames it, creating a figure larger than any flesh and blood individual could embody. By nightfall, the shadows of Smithfield stretch long across the cobblestones. You feel the strange weight of witnessing history and legend entwined. The executed man who becomes a symbol, the mortal who achieves immortality through courage, defiance, and collective memory. Wallace has passed from the world of flesh into the realm of ideas, and you trudge alongside his story, feeling the resonance of a life turned timeless through both suffering and inspiration. You trudge through the rolling hills and misty valleys of Scotland in the days immediately following Wallace's execution, the land still whispering with tension, grief, and the restless echo of defiance. Villages are quieter than usual, but beneath that calm lies a simmering determination. You probably won't survive the mixture of fear and hope that grips Scotland if you are wandering these glens. But tonight, you get to observe safely. So, before you get comfortable, remember to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and post your location and local time. It's grounding to see who's tracing these posthumous echoes with you. Now dim the lights, switch on that soft fan hum, and let's trudge into Wallace's immediate legacy. Word of his execution spreads like wildfire, carried by travelers, merchants, and whispered rumors. You trudge through villages where elders tell the tale in hushed tones. Children mimic the defiant gestures of a man they have never met, and bards begin weaving stories that merge courage with myth. Mainstream historians note that Wallace's death did not end resistance. Rather, it fueled further rebellion, inspiring figures like Andrew Murray and other local leaders to continue the fight for Scottish independence. The momentum of his defiance is tangible, even among the fearful and downtrodden. Quirky detail. Some accounts claim that in certain villages, women placed small tokens, perhaps a carved wooden sword or ribbon, outside windows as silent tributes to Wallace's bravery. It's a quaint gesture, almost folkloric, but it reflects the human need to honor courage in the face of oppression. You trudge past these imagined gestures, sensing the collective heartbeat of a nation remembering its hero. Historians still argue whether the immediate post-execution uprisings were directly coordinated in response to Wallace's death, or whether they were spontaneous local expressions of anger and defiance. Either way, the reaction is swift and striking. You trudge alongside groups of guerrilla fighters, organizing ambushes, disrupting English supply lines, and communicating across glens and rivers, echoing Wallace's own tactical methods. In towns and strongholds previously loyal to the English crown, fear turns to quiet rebellion. Cheeky, almost ironic anecdote. One story suggests that English soldiers discovered their horses mysteriously relocated by villagers in the night, a subtle form of resistance inspired by Wallace's legendary cunning. These acts are small but psychologically powerful, keeping the spirit of defiance alive. You trudge past councils of local leaders who debate whether to act openly or continue covert resistance. Wallace's legend empowers them, offering a moral framework and a symbol of courage to rally around. Quirky detail. Some bards claim that even in defeat, Wallace's gaze seemed to watch over Scotland, an almost spectral presence encouraging acts of bravery and quiet subversion. Historians still argue how much of this immediate legacy was practical inspiration versus symbolic myth-making. The English, of course, attempt to quell unrest. Patrols intensify, fortifications are reinforced, and propaganda emphasizes the futility of rebellion. Yet every punitive action inadvertently strengthens Wallace's image. You trudge through towns where people whisper, "If Wallace lived, we would fight. If he is gone, we must fight in his name." This collective reinterpretation of his life into a rallying cry demonstrates the paradox of martyrdom. The more the oppressors attempt to suppress him, the more his influence spreads. Even within his former followers, morale and strategic innovation flourish. You trudge beside scouts who mimic his techniques, training younger fighters in ambushes, reconnaissance, and coded communication. The immediate legacy is not only emotional, but practical. Wallace's strategies, values, and ethos endure in every skirmish, every secret gathering, every subtle act of defiance. Quirky anecdote. Some sources claim that English forces, paranoid about Wallace's lingering presence, conducted night searches of empty hills and forests, imagining him observing their every move. It's amusing perhaps, but it underscores how reputation alone can influence action long after death. By the end of these first months, you trudge through a Scotland transformed. Fear is tempered by courage, despair by determination, and oppression by the persistent whisper of hope. Wallace's immediate legacy is alive, dynamic, and complex, a blend of practical resistance, mythic inspiration, and symbolic power that will ripple through every rebellion and every heart willing to defy tyranny. Even as the landscape shifts under the weight of English retaliation, his presence lingers, shaping the choices of those who dare to dream of freedom. You trudge across the scarred battlefields of Scotland, where morning mist clings to trenches, splintered earth, and the remnants of hastily abandoned camps. The echoes of Wallace's campaigns resonate in the soil, a ghostly rhythm of footsteps, swords, and whispered commands. You probably won't survive wandering these haunted fields if you were there, but tonight, you can follow safely. So, before you get comfortable, remember to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and post your location and local time. It's grounding to see who's tracing these spectral echoes with me. Now dim the lights, switch on that soft fan hum, and let's trudge among the ghosts on the battlefield. Even after Wallace's execution, his presence lingers in the minds and strategies of Scottish fighters. You trudge alongside militias who recall his maneuvers, ambushes, and daring attacks. Mainstream history notes that Scottish forces, inspired by Wallace's legacy, continue to harry English troops, exploiting the knowledge of terrain, surprise, and timing he perfected. Every ridge, river crossing, and wooded glen carries the memory of tactics honed under his leadership. Quirky detail. Local folklore suggests that Wallace's spirit sometimes appears to guide fighters through foggy passes or warn them of approaching danger, a kind of spectral general leading troops from beyond the grave. Imagine guerrilla fighters glancing through the misty forests and believing that a familiar silhouette or a sudden gust of wind carries the ghostly guidance of their fallen hero. Historians still argue whether these ghostly influences were genuine superstition among troops or a symbolic framework to sustain morale and cohesion. You trudge past encampments where whispers of Wallace's shadow give courage to the weary and intimidate hesitant allies, blurring the line between myth and psychological warfare. English soldiers, conversely, report a sense of unease on familiar Scottish fields, as though the terrain itself conspires against them. Quirky anecdote. Some English patrols claim that they repeatedly stumble over hidden ditches or trip on rocks that seem to have shifted overnight. A trick of memory, terrain, or perhaps the lingering fear inspired by Wallace's spectral reputation. You trudge through skirmishes that echo the strategies Wallace pioneered. Sudden ambushes from unexpected angles, decoy camps, and rapid dispersal before a full engagement. Cheeky joke. One local bard quips that Wallace's ghost has a better sense of timing than the English generals, highlighting how legend and lore influence perception as much as skill. Historians still debate how much these tactics were consciously inspired by Wallace's teachings versus improvisation by his successors. Even small villages and rural communities contribute to the enduring presence of Wallace's shadow. You trudge past homes where farmers and shepherds warn passing rebels of approaching English patrols, relaying information in code or through hidden signals. These networks, inspired by Wallace's strategies and ethos, turn ordinary landscapes into living extensions of his influence. Quirky detail. Some accounts suggest that stray animals, cows, dogs, or horses were sometimes interpreted as omens of Wallace's spirit, guiding troops or foreshadowing English movements. While likely coincidental, such stories reinforce the perception of supernatural oversight on the battlefield, maintaining morale in the face of danger. By twilight, you trudge along riverbanks and forested hills where the past seems to linger tangibly. The ghosts of Wallace's battles, strategies, and defiance permeate the land, shaping both action and imagination. Cheeky remark, one soldier allegedly muttered. If only Wallace were alive to lecture us, at least we'd have some hope of winning. A humorous yet poignant acknowledgement of his enduring authority. Historians still argue whether the psychological impact of Wallace's legend truly altered the course of subsequent skirmishes, or simply provided a narrative comfort to struggling Scottish forces. Either way, his presence, tactical, moral, and symbolic, remains undeniable. You trudge through this complex blend of memory, strategy, and myth, sensing that even in death, Wallace commands attention, inspires courage, and haunts the battlegrounds of his homeland. By nightfall, the fog settles over trenches and ruined fortifications, carrying with it the whispers of a man who has become more idea than flesh. You trudge alongside these ghosts, witnessing how one life, one legendary figure, can echo through time, shaping actions, beliefs, and the very landscape in which history unfolds. You trudge through dusty libraries, the scent of aged parchment and ink curling into your nostrils, as Scotland's history begins to take shape, not just in memory, but in literature. You probably won't survive the endless debates over myth versus fact if you were trying to trace Wallace's story firsthand. But tonight, you can wander safely through the written echoes of his legend. So, before you get comfortable, remember to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and post your location and local time. It's grounding to see who's following these literary trails with me. Now, dim the lights, turn on that soft fan hum, and let's trudge through Wallace in literature. The earliest chronicles depict Wallace as both hero and rebel. You trudge alongside scribes and monks, quills scratching across parchment, trying to capture the events that still smell of blood and mud. Mainstream history notes that sources like The Wallace by Blind Harry, written in the late 15th century, dramatized his life, blending historical facts with embellishments, romance, and moral lessons for Scottish readers. The line between reality and legend blurs, but the effect is profound. Wallace becomes a moral compass and symbol of national pride. Quirky detail: Blind Harry's account famously includes fantastical feats, such as Wallace lifting enormous stones or personally defeating dozens of enemies in single skirmishes. Imagine a man already legendary in life, now portrayed as a near superhuman figure in text. This is the medieval version of superhero exaggeration, and it's both entertaining and culturally illuminating. Historians still argue whether these literary embellishments helped preserve Scotland's history or distorted it beyond recognition. You trudge past manuscripts that debate his exact age, height, and appearance, wondering how much fact survives the narrative swirl. These tales, however, spread across towns, inspiring oral recitations, performances, and eventually printed editions. By the 16th and 17th centuries, Wallace's story becomes a fixture of patriotic literature. You trudge through poetry and ballads, sensing the rhythm of words crafted to inspire courage, loyalty, and defiance. Cheeky anecdote. Some verses describe Wallace shouting to rally troops while performing acrobatics, clearly written to excite audiences rather than record facts. Yet these hyperbolic images ensure that even generations far removed from his lifetime feel his presence vividly. You trudge through debates among scholars and poets, some insisting Wallace was purely heroic, others emphasizing moral failings or political naivety. Historians still argue whether literature immortalized the man himself, or merely the idea of resistance against oppression. Quirky detail. One playful poem depicts Wallace negotiating with English nobles while simultaneously wrestling a wild boar. A scene obviously fictional, yet memorable, highlighting how imagination preserves legacy. Translations, reinterpretations, and plays further extend his influence. You trudge alongside actors on makeshift stages, their performances drawing crowds eager to glimpse the hero in action. Moral lessons entwined with entertainment. Each retelling adds layers, nuances, and occasional inaccuracies. But the core essence of Wallace, as a symbol of Scottish independence, endures. Even beyond Scotland, Wallace appears in European literature, his story adapted to local tastes and cultural frameworks. You trudge through texts in Latin, French, and English, noting how his image shifts subtly. In some, he's a tactical genius, in others, a martyr or moral exemplar. Historians still debate how much these foreign renditions shaped perceptions in Scotland itself versus abroad. Cheeky observation. Some later authors humorously exaggerate his height and strength to comic proportions, creating almost caricatured versions of the hero. These playful exaggerations, while not historically accurate, reinforce the psychological power of his story, turning him into a figure larger than any battlefield could contain. By nightfall, you trudge past stacks of illuminated manuscripts, printed pamphlets, and recited ballads. Wallace in literature is no longer simply a historical figure. He has become a cultural touchstone, a lens through which Scotland views courage, justice, and defiance. The stories may bend and twist with each retelling, but the core resonates across centuries, ensuring that the Guardian of Scotland lives on, not only in history, but in imagination, words, and the collective memory of a nation. You trudge into the glow of modern cinema, where flickering light replaces torch and candle, and the scent of popcorn mingles with suspense. Wallace's story, centuries old, now finds itself projected onto giant screens and streaming devices worldwide. You probably won't survive the blend of fact and Hollywood flair if you tried to dissect it all. But tonight, you can observe safely. So, before you get comfortable, remember to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and post your location and local time. It's grounding to see who's tracing this cinematic journey with me. Now, dim the lights, turn on that soft fan hum, and let's trudge into Hollywood's Braveheart. Mel Gibson's 1995 Braveheart transforms William Wallace from historical figure into a global icon of rebellion, romance, and cinematic heroism. You trudge through the intense battle scenes, recreated with dramatic music, slow-motion swordplay, and emotional speeches that swell to inspire tears, cheers, or goosebumps. Mainstream commentary notes that while the film captures the spirit of Scottish defiance, it takes substantial liberties with dates, relationships, and events for narrative effect. Quirky detail. The famous blue face paint Wallace wears in the film is entirely fictional. Medieval Scots didn't decorate themselves with woad in the late 13th century. That was centuries earlier, yet the striking visual became an enduring symbol of rugged rebellion in pop culture. You trudge alongside the visual spectacle, marveling at how one color on a face can ignite an idea, even if it bends historical truth. Historians still argue whether films like Braveheart educate or mislead audiences about Wallace's life. You trudge past sweeping reenactments of Stirling Bridge battles, romantic subplots, and dramatized speeches. While thrilling, they compress timelines, merge characters, and exaggerate personal relationships to heighten drama. Cheeky remark. Some viewers insist Wallace never shouted "freedom" with such gusto, yet the phrase is now inseparable from his cultural image. The film also amplifies the martyrdom and mythos of Wallace, blending history with legend. You trudge through scenes showing English oppression, heroic rallies, and tragic personal loss, sensing that Hollywood is less concerned with factual precision than emotional impact. Quirky anecdote. Gibson reportedly encouraged actors to chew on leather belts and even smell horses to feel authentic. A minor historical oddity that adds theatrical flair more than accuracy. You trudge into scholarly debates ignited by the film. Historians still argue how much popular perception of Wallace owes to cinematic storytelling versus historical records. Some critics praise the film for inspiring interest in Scottish history. Others lament the distortion of facts and the simplification of complex political realities into good versus evil tropes. Despite inaccuracies, Braveheart revives Wallace's legend globally. You trudge past classrooms, trivia nights, and film clubs where debates rage over what's true versus cinematic license. Cheeky observation. Wallace has become a symbol not only of Scottish independence, but of personal courage and defiance. Inspiring speeches, tattoos, and even motivational posters, often divorced entirely from historical context. The film's emotional power lies in its myth-making. You trudge with Wallace through imagined speeches, heroic charges, and intimate moments that compress years of struggle into a cinematic heartbeat. Quirky detail. Some historians note that the real Stirling Bridge battle didn't feature the large open field clashes depicted, but instead relied heavily on narrow positioning and tactical ambush. Yet the cinematic version resonates more vividly in cultural memory. By nightfall, you trudge past glowing screens and the hum of projectors, realizing that Hollywood has transformed Wallace into a living myth for a global audience. His story, filtered through legend, literature, and now film, exists in layers: historical man, literary hero, and cinematic icon. And while debates about accuracy will never end, his image continues to inspire courage, resistance, and imagination, proof that legend can be as powerful as life itself. You trudge through classrooms, libraries, and digital forums, where scholars, students, and enthusiasts endlessly dissect Wallace's life, choices, and legacy. The air is thick with the mingled scents of old books, coffee, and the faint hum of computers. You probably won't survive the sheer volume of conflicting opinions if you try to internalize them all. But tonight, you can wander safely among the debates. So, before you get comfortable, remember to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and post your location and local time. It's grounding to see who's exploring Wallace's story alongside you. Now dim the lights, switch on that soft fan hum, and let's trudge into the enduring debate. Historians still argue whether Wallace was a freedom fighter, a rebel, or a politically naive figure whose defiance brought more suffering than liberation. You trudge past stacks of essays, journals, and treatises where arguments twist and loop back on themselves. Mainstream scholarship emphasizes his tactical genius and symbolic role in galvanizing Scotland's resistance against English domination. Yet fringe or revisionist interpretations probe deeper, questioning his personal motivations, alliances, and sometimes even the precise details of his life and death. Quirky detail. One fringe theory amusingly suggests that Wallace may have had little interest in national politics at all and was primarily motivated by personal revenge after a skirmish involving his family. While most historians dismiss this as unlikely, it adds an extra layer of intrigue to a man already shrouded in legend. You trudge through the mental corridors of possibility, where historical fact, speculation, and storytelling intermingle like shadows at dusk. Wallace's life, legend, and martyrdom continue to provoke debate about the nature of heroism. You trudge alongside scholars dissecting sources, English chronicles painting him as a traitor, Scottish ballads elevating him to near mythical status, and later historians trying to parse what actually happened. Cheeky observation. It's almost as if Wallace knew centuries later people would argue over every glance, every word, every battle. He'd probably chuckle at the endless intellectual warfare. Some discussions focus on the impact of Wallace's campaigns. Did they hasten Scottish independence? Or merely prolong suffering without strategic gain? Historians still debate whether his influence was immediate, delayed, or primarily symbolic. You trudge past reenactment groups, museum exhibits, and academic conferences where tactical analyses meet philosophical discussions, and every conclusion sparks another question. Literature, film, and folklore further complicate the debate. You trudge through versions of Wallace in Blind Harry's epic modern novels, and Hollywood films like Braveheart, noting how each medium emphasizes different traits: courage, brutality, romance, or morality. Quirky detail. Some literary depictions even merge Wallace with mythic figures, like King Arthur analogues, illustrating the human tendency to elevate historical actors into archetypal icons. Historians still argue how much these cultural reinterpretations distort or preserve his historical truth. Even today, Wallace inspires political symbolism. You trudge past monuments, flags, and commemorations where interpretations diverge. Some view him as a unifying figure, others as a cautionary rebel. Cheeky observation. Tourists occasionally argue about whether his statue should be historically accurate or heroically dramatic. A microcosm of the broader debate that spans centuries. By nightfall, you trudge through the mental landscape of debate, realizing that Wallace's life, death, and legend are more than historical record. They are a living conversation. Every analysis, speculation, and reinterpretation adds a layer to his enduring mystique. Historians may never settle on a single narrative, yet in that uncertainty, Wallace thrives as a symbol of courage, resistance, and the complex interplay between fact, legend, and memory. You pause at the edge of a quiet Scottish hilltop in your imagination, the wind rustling through heather, the landscape echoing with centuries of reflection. Wallace may be gone, his body long absent from the battlefield, yet the questions about him remain alive, shaping thought, culture, and inspiration. You trudge onward in spirit, witnessing a story that refuses to be simple, a life that continues to provoke wonder, admiration, and endless debate. As the night deepens, you trudge one last time through Scotland, the rolling hills softened by moonlight, rivers reflecting starlight, and the wind whispering through trees as though carrying the voice of Wallace himself. You've seen him as a boy, a rebel, a strategist, a captive, and a symbol. Each step traced through history has revealed the man behind the legend and the legend behind the man. You probably won't survive the centuries of myth and memory if you try to carry it all at once. But here, in the gentle hush of night, you can absorb it, letting it linger in your thoughts like the faint echo of a distant drum. The landscapes you've imagined, the highlands, the lowlands, the battlefields, and the corridors of power hold both truth and embellishment. Yet in every telling, Wallace's spirit persists: courage, defiance, and a refusal to submit echo across centuries, inspiring songs, literature, films, and even quiet personal reflection. Cheeky, almost tender thought. Even centuries later, he might smile at the idea that his story travels faster than the fastest cavalry, through whispers, books, and streaming pixels. You feel the weight and the lightness of legend coexisting. Scotland itself seems to breathe with the memory of its hero, reminding you that history is not just dates and battles, but human resilience, moral choices, and the power of narrative. Even as the candle flickers and the fan hums softly, Wallace's story remains alive, a bridge connecting past courage with present reflection. So take a deep breath, feel the chill of misty hills or imagined winds on your skin, and let the tale of William Wallace settle gently in your mind. He may have fallen, been captured, and executed, but in memory, literature, and imagination, he walks beside you still. And now, as your eyelids grow heavy, the story closes softly, the night holding both fact and legend in a comforting embrace. Sweet dreams.